Crusader Kings III is the third entry in the medieval Orcs RPG unearthed in the DLC mines of Paradox Interactive. A little while ago I did the impossible and managed to cram the square peg of real genetics into the now horribly gaping round hole of CK2. If you compare half an hour of my insufferable content with even worse audio than this, you should check that out. But in that video, all that happened was that I invented genetic pathways that could feasibly, not really, result in the highly unrealistic inheritance patterns observed in the game. Now those who have dabbled in both recent Crusader Kings games would know that there's been a bit of an overhaul of the genetics in CK3 compared to CK2. CK3 has kind of a more complex, well, okay, let's say different model for genetics than CK2, in that recessivity exists or is claimed to. We'll get to that. Implying, unlike CK2 characters, CK3 characters have diploid genomes. But anyway, let's sink our rotten little teeth into some of the genetics in CK3. Part 1. Desirable traits. As much as the Crusader Kings player base likes to talk about eugenics, of course what they're usually actually talking about is selective breeding. There's an important difference. Eugenics is an ideological position, whereas selective breeding is, like, an activity, I guess? And the two games handle this activity differently, neither of which is very accurate to the real world. Now if you're some little nerd trying to breed in desirable traits to your little digital monarchy, then that conceptual desire, implemented through selective breeding, is surely eugenics, right? Particularly as you'd be structuring the very top position of your little monarchical society around those selected genetic traits. Well, not quite. We're actually ignoring society, being the nameless, characterless peasants that equate to development, tax, and levies, to instead describe a prerequisite trait that's absence is somewhat, based on the player's actions, preclusive to allowing the inheritance of a title. Fundamentally, it's no more or less eugenicist than primogeniture or agnatic inheritance, or just monarchy for that matter, where there are traits that are deterministic for inheritance. Are you the firstborn? Are you a boy? Are you related to the last ruler? I think it's very fair to say that the feudal hierarchies of Europe fed directly into the development of eugenics, but they're not the same thing. Furthermore, desirable traits are completely decontextualized from social factors, which is of course the only basis within which they exist under eugenics, and are instead materially relevant and, most importantly, universal. Instead, I like to think of it more like agronomy or agricultural genetics, where you've got your livestock, the line of inheritance that, when bred to possess the positive congenital traits, gives a valuable and quantifiable benefit, things with no relevance to eugenics. My cows produce more milk. My CK3 characters fuck better. My sorghum is slightly more digestible by humans. My CK3 characters have a +5 to all their stats. Part 2. Selective breeding. There's some really important problems you need to be aware of when you're talking about selective breeding. Two very obvious ones include the question of ethics, and the capacity to manufacture a potentially really tight bottleneck, destroying genetic diversity and crippling the resilience of the population. We're going to be broadly ignoring the ethical considerations, because I don't think they're all that relevant to digital characters. But genetic diversity is certainly relevant, and we're also going to look at two other issues for complex, non-Mendelian traits. So the first of these to take into consideration is that, while you might think you're selecting for an outcome or phenotype, in many cases what you're actually selecting for is a biological function underpinning that phenotypic outcome, right? The second is that, let's say you are selecting for an outcome and there are no direct issues with doing that. What are the unintended consequences of possibly accentuating that trait? So the issues here are, what's the functional biology that's changing? What are the effects of that change? And sometimes it isn't clear for any specific situation which of these problems may be relevant, or it could be both. How about we head into the classroom and work through a practice example? Let's say I have a monopoly of eggs in all of China, and my wife is super rich, living in a mansion. I want my chickens to produce larger eggs. In pursuing this goal that you'll remember I have a monopoly of across all of China, I'm going to selectively breed my most prodigious and big egg producing hens with roosters of particularly large eggy stock. Around the time the man who has a monopoly of milk in all of China, has the entire bovine population of the New Republic redistributed, I have successfully increased egg size to levels heretofore not believed possible. As the Cultural Revolution happens and just before communism takes everything away, I notice that my hens are commonly suffering fractures and have incredibly fragile bones leading to shortened lifespans. What might be going on? Here are two possibilities. 1. The accentuated egg size that I have selected for has reached a threshold requiring more calcium intake than the hens are able to absorb. Or 2. I believed I was selecting for egg size, but in actuality the heightened big egg was just a symptom of incidentally selecting for increased blood flow to the shell gland and heightened draw on skeletal calcium stores during shell calcification. Hopefully you can then see the issues that can arise if you aren't aware of the underlying genetics. Very interesting. Part 3. Selective breeding for traits in Crusader Kings. First things first, I said both CK2 and CK3 are different from each other and inaccurate in how they model selective breeding. Now for CK2, all we need to know is simply that it is less likely that a congenital trait is passed on to an offspring than not, no matter what. Meaning, traits will always be lost over time, reaching an equilibrium a little bit above the mutation rate. And this is in opposition to the inbred trait, where the chance to inherit the trait increases and reaches 100%. So this implies, if you don't believe the methods of inheritance described in my CK2 video, that phenotypic traits can't be selected for, even though they must exist within a genomic environment that is genetically allelic, diverse, and functional. This is completely fucking insane. In fact, too insane to be believable, thereby lending further credence to the scientific rigor of my CK2 video. So then what's the deal with CK3? Well, here's a delightful diagram that outlines the different types of inheritable traits. You'll notice in amongst all of this highly detailed information, there are two very clear groupings. The active-inactive inheritance type, where you find most traits, and I guess we can call it the updated CK2 inheritance type. The difference is, either characters can gain inactive versions of traits that don't give a phenotype, as in there are no stat changes and the trait isn't visible, but these characters can still pass the trait on to their offspring, implying something approximating a recessive allele, or not that. Having the trait means it impacts the character, you get your little icon, and that icon is necessary to pass it on. It's actually a bit hard to pass all this because the game lies to you. And the text files also lie, with listed inheritance chance that isn't relevant because there's also a boolean genetic equals yes line that makes the inheritance the active-inactive type. And the mathematics of how these are inherited follows these matrices that I stole from the wiki. Now this is really weird genetically speaking. So let's try and dive into what's actually happening, and we'll start with the active-inactive inheritance type. Part 3.1. Fake recessivity. A recessive trait requires both copies of a gene to be the same recessive allele to show a phenotype. This can be the result of a whole bunch of biomechanistic reasons, but invariably results in loss of function. So what a recessive trait can do is sort of limited by the functional reality of biology. If you think about recessive traits in people, you're talking about things like earwax consistency, or you're talking an array of congenital diseases through to non-viability. Not really the sort of stuff that can result in +4 prowess, you know. When we're talking about the tiered negative congenital traits, they are inherited identically to the positive traits, and function on a sort of scale with 3 genes, each with 7 phenotypes, 3 negative, 1 neutral, and 3 positive. So the conception of recessive inheritance is extremely tenuous in these examples. Furthermore, these traits can be upgraded through selective breeding. So for example, if 2 characters who have the quick trait mate, there's a 50% chance an offspring will have the intelligent trait, which is 1 tier above in the intellect group. This of course is really helpful for gaining desirable traits, but this upgrading feature is incredibly problematic for trying to describe the underlying genetics. Because if a recessive trait is the result of something not happening, loss of function, you can't make it worse or better by having it not happen more, right? You need something really complex going on to achieve that. We can't even imagine the non-tiered negative traits all as recessive congenital diseases, because if these traits are truly recessive, then the idea of opposite traits, as they exist, like dwarf and giant or spindly and robust, aren't being modelled. These are things that, if they actually were recessively inherited, would be phenotypically incompatible, but they could still both be genetically present. This is what we'd call epistasis. the phenotypically present trait is epistatic to the hypostatic one we don't observe. But that's not the case here. We'd expect the non-visible trait to be inherited at the same rate as the visible trait, but only become active when the incompatible epistatic trait wasn't present. It's not happening. The non-viable trait is inherited inactively or not at all. This also rules out funky penetrance or expressivity effects causing our apparent inheritance patterns. Things could be partially inactive, but still maintain inheritance rates. Again, sadly it's not happening. So there's actually something functionally, genetically different about inactive versions of traits compared to their active counterparts. But apart from the genetic issues with that at face value, a further problem is that a character who possesses an inactive version of a trait, who mates with another character with neither an active or inactive version, can still pass on an active trait to their offspring. If you think about the chickens I was breeding, we can conceptualize the problem with CK3 selective breeding. We can look at it in two ways. First, a Mendelian-style recessive big egg allele, where we'd see phenotypes like this, with all other genetic and environmental factors combining to give the spread of egg sizes around the impact of a particularly important gene. Or, we're talking about an even more complex trait, where no single gene has a particularly noticeable contribution and many environmental factors are also involved. In the first example, we'd want an allele to proliferate through our chicken population, thereby moving the spread to the big egg curve. In the second example, your preferential breeding of desired individuals slowly shifts the peak in the desired direction and restricts the range of phenotypes. Because we're talking about continuous generations without introducing functional mutations, the outcome will always be within the bounds of the original spread, assuming a sufficiently large population allowing for all allelic configurations. And if it is normally distributed, then it will not stably sit at the maximum point, because that is necessarily a complex configuration that will always be disrupted each generation due to its infrequency. Now compare these to what we're seeing in CK3 traits. We've got precise phenotypes in a Mendelian sense, with no other contributing factors. Selecting for a desired trait will proliferate that trait through the next generation, moving the population to our desired curve, or point in this case. But selective breeding will also move the curve out beyond the existent phenotype in tiered traits, but due to inactive inheritance, can never become stable with full proliferation of the trait. So we've got this weird situation that cannot function, where selective breeding follows both a highly complex distribution of many factors, but is also genetically specific and discrete in outcomes on the level of a single gene. It's ludicrous! Part 3.2. CK2 Style Inheritance. Now that we've got the fancy new inheritance out of the way and seen that it doesn't work that well, we'll get to the second type, where you've just got a standard CK2 style chance to inherit if a parent possesses the trait. There are only 4 relevant traits that fit this category: inbred, pure-blooded, and 2 vertically transmissible diseases. We're talking herpes and syph, baby! In the real world, syphilis wasn't present anywhere on the CK3 map until after the end date, but ignoring that, transmission of these 2 diseases from parent to offspring requires the mother to be infected. The father isn't relevant except indirectly if he infected the mother. So the game would be accurate in modelling vertical transmission here by not modulating inheritance chance if both parents possess the trait, having it just be a flat 10% no matter what, as is claimed in the text files and the Paradox wiki. Except that each parent has an additive effect on inheritance chance. These diseases in CK3 have horizontally entered the CK3 character genome and become insane transmissible transposons apparently, somehow. Now the more interesting of these traits are inbred and pure-blooded. Okay, before we get into anything, just looking at the inbred trait alone, the text files and Paradox wiki both lie to us once again, suggesting 15% inheritance chance regardless of if just a single parent has the trait or if both parents have the trait. I did a small test with one father with the inbred trait and 3 mothers all with the inbred trait as well, all of whom are totally unrelated to each other, as in no shared ancestors at all. Of 129 offspring from these pairings, 36 possessed the inbred trait. We would expect about 19 if the trait were inherited at 15%, or 39 if the parents provide additive inheritance, giving 30%. A very simple chi-squared test shows a statistically significant result for the inheritance being additive. This is what I did for the Grey Pox inheritance too, but we're just going to have to wildly speculate about Lover's Pox because I couldn't be bothered testing for that one as well. The inbred trait and the pure-blooded trait are quite similar, inbreeding resulting in a trait outcome. Of course, inbred is obviously a nebulous term compared to inbreeding. but basically it's some conception of the point where either one particularly obvious detrimental trait manifests from homozygosity of a rare allele, or a whole bunch of genes become homozygous with detrimental alleles that might be trivial in isolation but collectively cause some issues, or it might relate to a feature of a population where a rare trait increases in frequency to significantly above the typical occurrence as a result of familial reproduction. All of these are based on the fact that a familial population is not a representative sample of the actual genetic diversity among the total population. And CK3 actually tries to represent this, with the inbred trait only appearing if another negative congenital trait is also present in addition to consanguinity. Consanguinity. But not to beat a dead horse too much about recessive traits not existing in the game, these traits become increasingly likely to appear the more common ancestors shared by the parents, again implying inactive traits are not models of recessive alleles, but something functionally different because they spontaneously appear without the inactive version first. We know this because these traits manifesting do so at the inbreeding rate rather than the inactive inheritance rate. Anyway, on top of all of the rest of it, the problem, genetically speaking, with inbreeding is that we are, all of us, riddled with shit in our genomes, but genetic diversity smooths it over. So, I suggested pure-blooded and inbred are similar, and the notion of inbreeding in CK3 leading to either of these traits lends itself to the fallacious, platonic ideal of social Darwinism built on fantasy, being the desirability of a restriction of genetic diversity based on good genes or alleles. But of course that's not quite what's happening here. There's actually a fundamental difference between the inbred trait and the pure-blooded trait, which I touched on just before, being some other trait needs to be present. You do not need a good trait to gain pure-blooded, but you need a negative trait to gain inbred. So what is implied is that pure-bloodedness is the absence of negative alleles with a non-eugenicsy understanding of the purely social conception of goodness in relation to genetic function. But of course we're actually talking about a trait with a function. Increased fertility, increased health, and reduced inbreeding chance. So what the fuck is going on? So in reality, mutations occur. Shocking and incredibly informative. They occur at a rate we can estimate. A mutation rate. This can be specific for a species, for an organism, for a population, an environment, a specific gene, a cell type, a chromosome, or any other genetic feature, and importantly, for evolution, for a germline. When we're talking about mutations that lead to inheritable traits, or alleles, we're talking about germline mutations. And in humans, most of the time, they come from the father because the overwhelming majority of germline cell divisions occurs in spermatogonial stem cells. Those are the cells that make the cum full of sperm. And in humans, we've got a germline mutation rate sitting somewhere around the 1 to 2 times 10 to the negative 8 mutations per base pair per generation. And because we've got about 6.4 billion base pairs across both pairs of chromosomes, quite a few mutations actually occur per generation, but they occur across an enormous span of information, such that very, very few of them matter at all. And then there's also the bonus of having 2 copies of each gene and the genetic diversity that comes with that. Again, it gets smoothed over. One feature of our mutation rate is that it increases with the age of the parents, roughly in the manner of this graph. No units, but you get the picture. The reason I bring this up, not the last thing, that's just an interesting fact. The mutation rate in general. The reason that I bring up the mutation rate is that there's about a 12.7% chance any child in CK3 is born with a novel congenital trait, which neither parent has mutations for, which seems really high, implying perhaps the only pressure is an enormous mutation rate, and all this nonsense I've been trying to wade through is an incredibly complex genetic environment to protect against the terrifyingly DNA-hostile post-apocalyptic CK3 world. It would explain the problems with selective breeding somewhat, and it would definitely explain the presence of syphilis. Perhaps there are heaps of repeats of DNA repair proteins, where copies and functional mutations in this area have become highly advantageous, as there's firstly more repair proteins in absolute terms, but also a vast array of slight variations across the proteins, allowing for highly specialized repair responses, kind of like a proto-immune system. This would also be a great way of explaining the pure-blooded trait as a particularly good collection of these repair proteins. Unfortunately, we can't really use this 12.7% to estimate a germline mutation rate because we can't do sequencing. But let's do it anyway with the magic of assumptions. We need firstly to come up with a way of comparing de novo mutations to traits. And this is already a bit tricky because the vast majority of mutations that result in a phenotype are understandably the result of dominant genetic effects. And while we've seen that inactive inheritance in CK3 is not recessive inheritance, it absolutely can't be a standard dominant inheritance. So I suggest that there might be repeats, and most importantly very high levels of functional and non-functional heterogeneity across the population at every trait relevant locus, such that a single mutation can often result in a trait. We'll just ignore the problem of inactive trait inheritance and say it's like a population genetics calculation for allele frequency, but applied on the scale of individual organisms, and pretend it makes sense, and is like the result of mechanical limitations of the genetics model. With that, we'll say that CK3 characters are human, so we can claim average exon size for genes is about 3.4 kilobases, and we'll highball it and say this protein coding component accounts for 2% of the genome, and the rest accounts for introns, functional non-coding features, and non-coding RNA transposons and pseudogenes and whatnot. Additionally, we'll say tiered traits are the same gene, with the different mutation rate constituting increasingly specific mutations needed, but opposites are different genes that are epistatic, ignoring what I said before. This means we've got only 21 genes, including the poxes, because they have to be, but excluding inbred and pure-blooded because they're definitely different. So we've got a genome that's about 3.57 megabases long, an adorable, teeny-weeny prokaryotic sized little thing. Now, if every birth has a 12.7% chance of a trait causing mutation occurring within 2% of the genome, and we'll be extremely generous in what that means, just one random point mutation needed, then the mutation rate for CK3 characters is a terrifying 6.7 de novo mutations per birth, or just about 9 times 10 to the negative 7 mutations per base pair per generation. Fuck. It was all looking so perfect for a second. It seemed like I'd figured it out. It was just mutations, and pure-blooded and inbred were epigenetic traits. I could come up with something to do with cytosine methylation and specialized histone methylation. The inbred and pure-blooded traits then would just be the manifestations of negative and positive epigenetic regulation respectively, to avoid point mutations and mitigate the effect of environmental mutagens, protecting from what I assumed was to be a horrifying mutation rate. And it even fit with the blood dynastic legacy and the strong blood decision. I mean, it fit clunkily, but, you know. But now nothing makes sense. If only Paradox hired me or someone, or me, please, to develop a manageable and accurate genetic system.